Is Korea wanting that? Does Korea want that? And that's sort of a key question. The last time I was here, there was a big... And now with the new truck, the auto industry really, at the end of the day, is a scale industry. Economies of scale industries. You have to be big, and so Tesla doesn't have that. They're a niche player, and so the only thing Tesla can really do to differentiate themselves in the market is innovation. If they don't innovate, if they don't really push the boundaries with pretty radical innovations, nobody's going to pay any attention to them. So it's not clear, frankly, that Tesla's going to be successful for the simple reason that they had first mover advantage in electric vehicles, but now the major companies, Japan, Korea, Germany, US, they're all moving very rapidly into electric vehicles. So it's going to be harder for Tesla to differentiate themselves and get market share there. But I do think one of the lessons from Tesla is that big companies, big auto companies, need to innovate more. For Korea, companies like Hyundai and Kia, really have been fast follower companies. Early on, quality wasn't very good, and they really built that up now. Now they have, very high quality cars. But I think one of the things that's happening in the auto industry, and frankly this is happening in almost every major industry now, they're becoming innovation industries. And by that I mean innovation industries, what people think about are things like semiconductors and cell phones and the like, or biotechnology. An innovation industry is an industry where if you don't constantly innovate, particularly with new products, you're going to get left behind very quickly. The chip industry, for example, is not about just making more chips cheaper. It's always about getting that next generation. Traditional industries, like the auto industry, for example, have historically been, you could succeed by being slower. You didn't have to innovate as much, as long as you had high quality and you had reasonable costs, and you could do quite well. But I think the industries now are evolving to become innovation industries, and so particularly now in autos, where you've got really three big things happening. You've got connectivity, so you have connected vehicles, you've got autonomy, and you've got new energy vehicles, principally electric. So it really suggests that autos are at an inflection point, and if companies don't innovate more seriously, kind of like what Clay Christensen calls embrace disruptive innovation as opposed to incremental innovation, that there's a real possibility they could get left behind. So if I were, and I don't run a company, I don't advise companies, but just from looking at it from the outside, it really looks like traditional industries like autos have got to adopt the business model, the organizational models that more innovative industries and companies adopt, and really think of themselves as innovation industries. Obviously, AI is a component of software. We've had policies over the years that they tend to be a little more haphazard than some countries. One reason, for example, is our school curriculum is at the local and state level. So we have 50 different states. They all have responsibility for curriculum. But there has been a push over the years to get more computer science education, particularly in the high school level. The National Science Foundation funds computer science education and research at the college and graduate level, so there's been an increase in support for that. There is a national AI strategy that the Trump administration has put in place that, as a component of that, includes more AI science development, education, particularly at the college and graduate school level. So we have various policies and programs, so that they're not as well coordinated perhaps as in some countries. But sure, that's a priority focus for the U.S. Well, I think on any question, the answer is going to always be Singapore. So Singapore's always well coordinated. They have thought, I think, the computer science issue quite well, thought it through. There's a recent study that is, I think it's called the IEA maybe. I can get you the name of it, but it's an international education assessment, I think it's the name of the organization. It's based in Germany. And I was on a panel recently for the release of their new international comparison study, where they look at computer science capabilities in 8th grade around the world. And Korea is number 1, as I recall. And as I also recall, Korea is interesting because I could be wrong on this, but I think it's right. Girls and boys do about equally well in Korea. Girls actually might do slightly better. There's a little different. In most countries, girls are close to boys, but boys tend to be a little bit ahead of girls. I think in Korea, girls are at the same level, if not above. So that's interesting finding. But it suggests, at least up through the 8th grade, that Korea is doing quite well. Most of the U.S. technology companies, if they got any help, it might have been through a program we have called the SBIR program, the Small Business Innovation Research Program. And it's a program by which small companies can bid on work for the government to do research and development for the government. A company, Qualcomm is a good example of that, the wireless chip company. But by and large, the U.S. government hasn't funded companies all that much. The reason why I believe that Silicon Valley did as well as it did, well, historically, a lot of those companies historically had received government funding through the Defense Department. So Intel, for example, sold a lot of their chips early on to the Air Force. But it really wasn't so much about the government funding the companies as it was that there was just this innovation ecosystem that was there. And the other big component of that is risk-taking. In the U.S., it's not unusual for somebody to, a good example is Intel. Where did Intel come from? Intel came from Fairchild Semiconductor. And where did that came from? That came from, excuse me. That came from Shockley Semiconductor. So Shockley was a leading, he invented the transistor at Bell Labs. He went to Silicon Valley. He started a company. Nobody liked him. A bunch of the people left. They started Fairchild. And then a bunch of the Fairchild executives, I think they were called the Traitorous 8, I think. Maybe the Traitorous 7. They just left, decided to start their own company called Intel. So there's a lot of that. You see a lot less of that in Korea. And I think there's real strengths for that in the U.S. Companies, people, entrepreneurs, people they quit companies and they go start another one. The other advantage I think that we have, for example, if you look at a company like Qualcomm, that was started by Irwin Jacobs, who was a professor of wireless engineering at University of California, San Diego, and he just, in his research lab, he came up with this. He thought, oh, it's a pretty good idea. I think maybe there's a company there. So he started building it. He sold something, got some money from the Defense Department who was interested in this, and then just built a company. So the U.S. Sort of entrepreneurial ecosystem, I think, has been a big enabler and driver of that. Small firms on average, again, not every small firm, but on average are much lower in productivity than big firms. That gap is highest in Korea. Of all the OECD countries, that gap is highest in Korea. Korea has more small businesses than any OECD country, a higher share. has a higher share of workers in small businesses, and the gap between them and big companies is the biggest. So what's going on there? What's going on there is the average firm size in Korea is, for these small firms, is very low, very small. The U.S. has much bigger firms, even though Korea has the Chaebols and the Samsungs and the Hyundais of the world. Overall, Korea has lots and lots of small firms. And it's not to say that an economy should have only big firms. A healthy economy has a mix of firms. But in my view, Korea's firms it's skewed too far to this side, and it's just hard for small firms to have high productivity. They don't have the scale economies that you'd get with bigger firms. And also with information technology, IT is really a driver of productivity. And it's just hard for a small firm with 4 people or 6 people to really use IT effectively. In my view, Korea has a set of policies that perhaps keep more small firms in business than otherwise should be the case. And it's a tough choice. It's a choice for Korea, really, because if you want to move into having more firms that are mid-size and bigger, the small firms are going to get mad. They're going to, hey, you need to protect us. And perhaps the workers there will get mad. So I understand that this is a difficult political question, but I think ultimately for Korea to keep moving forward, both on a competitiveness side of things and the productivity side of things, it's really going to have to figure out a way to increase the average firm size in Korea and have middle-sized firms take some of that market share away from small firms. And that doesn't mean having the Chaebols get super big, you know. One of the differences, again, in the U.S. and Korea tends to be more bimodal. A bunch of big firms, a whole lot of small firms. In the U.S., you have a big, massive group of firms in the middle, 300 to 10,000, 300 to 1,000 workers, let's say. There's just hundreds and thousands of firms like that. And Korea doesn't have as many of those kinds of firms. So I think it's an interesting question and challenge that Korea, Japan, China, they all, in our view, have not really dealt with and grappled with as much as they might. But what I can say is it's incredibly short-sighted and harmful for Korea and Japan to engage in this kind of conflict, in my view. The real challenger here is China. China, in our view, and I was co-chair for President Obama for 6 years for this U.S.-China Innovation Experts Group, and so we've studied China extensively, and I've been to China, and I've read extensively, talked to officials. China is engaged in something no other country's ever been engaged in, and that is a drive to dominate global technology industries through a significant share of practices and policies that are unfair and distortive and mercantilist. China, for example, is building the largest DRAM factory in the world, dynamic random access memory chip factory. They are using technology that has been stolen from Micron out of Taiwan. That's proven fact. They stole the technology through paying for spies. They have subsidized this factory with written a check by the government just to build the factory. But it's very different for countries to support R&D, which Korea does, the U.S. does, Japan does, Germany does. It's very different than just writing a $3 billion check to a company to build a factory to compete in an industry where you already have, I don't want to say overcapacity, but you have full capacity with you have SK Hynix, Micron, and Samsung. There's no market demand and no market reason in the world for a company to do what China is doing other than government mercantilist practices. So that's just going to continue. China isn't backing down. They're working on every single technology that you can imagine. And unless Korea and Japan and the United States and democratic countries who are mostly market-oriented work together, I think we're all going to be in serious trouble 10, 15 years from now. So that's why it is so troubling to see what Korea and China are doing. And look, I'm not in either country, and there's national pride, and it goes back obviously to the war, which was horrible. I understand all that, but there's a big challenge happening, and it just seems to me both countries have got to say, okay, let's put the past behind us. I know how hard that is, and let's really move into the future together. So I hope, I keep my fingers crossed that that's what's going to happen, because I think that really is what has to happen. It's what I would have done in early 2000s under the Bush administration. We had an opportunity to reform our Social Security system so that it would, workers would have to work a little bit longer, they'd have to pay a little bit more. And instead, what we did is we didn't do that, but we cut taxes, including on wealthy people. That has meant that the U.S. budget deficit is enormous. I mean, it's just enormous. And it's going to get worse. And to me, that was the single biggest mistake in domestic policy that we've made. The reason it's a mistake is that right now, what we need to do more than anything else is increase public investment in things like STEM education and research and development, public-private partnerships for advanced technology. And we just don't have the money to do it anymore. Another thing we need to do is we need to counter the Chinese with their One Belt, One Road initiative. We should be working collaboratively with Japan and perhaps Korea, I don't know what Korea is doing, to help countries in Africa, and Southeast Asia, and Latin America build infrastructure, 5G and others, but build them with Western or Asian, democratic country technology. We don't have the money to do that. So I think that's one big mistake. In Europe, the mistake I would roll back is I think it was a very serious mistake for the Europeans to pass the GDPR, the General Data Privacy Protection Regulation. The reason I think that was a mistake, not because I don't think countries should have privacy rules, I do, but the GDPR was so extensive and so broad, and it was written before people were talking about AI, that it's really going to make it hard for the Europeans to do AI in Europe and to move to a data-driven economy. So I think that was a mistake they made, and hopefully they can rectify that and fix that. For Korea, it would probably be, there's a commission that Korea set up to help small businesses and defend small businesses. I think that's probably a mistake. I think, as I said before, I think Korea has too many little teeny businesses, 3 people, 4 people, and I would just move in the other direction. A whole new set of technologies, like, for example, IoT or AI or autonomous systems, 5G. These are important technologies. They're coming together in a confluence, a collective. And so countries that want to succeed in the next wave have got to be able to master all of those. And so I give Korea a lot of credit for having that vision and putting resources behind it. So I say that. The other part of that, though, I'd have to say is it's not just about supporting R&D and the like. These technologies, much more than the last wave of technology, are disruptive. So the last wave of technologies was really about the internet. It was about it was about computing and the internet. What people call Wintelism, Windows and Intel, and then the internet on top of that. It it was somewhat disruptive, but it wasn't massively disruptive. I think this next wave is much more disruptive. Unless countries embrace that, you're not going to get all of the benefits of that. So for example, we are working on a joint project with another team, a group of colleagues I have called the Leading Edge Forum. And we're working on a year-long project looking at large enterprise, how the fourth industrial revolution could really transform large enterprises, whether it's in insurance or manufacturing or logistics or whatever it might be. And our view is that it could be pretty transformational and include a high level of automation. Is Korea wanting that? Does Korea want that? And that's sort of a key question. The last time I was here, there was a big demonstration by taxi drivers. Yeah, and don't get me wrong, I don't mean to imply that those are not tough issues or that the individuals involved don't have a right to be upset. I absolutely understand that. Disruption is disruption, it's upsetting. But to take advantage of it, to be a fourth industrial leader, one can't just be producing the things, the chips or the robots or whatever. One has to be using them. And so, for example, I think Korea's efforts on smart cities are fantastic. If you want to be a leader in IoT technology, smart city technology, you've got to be using it. You've got to be deploying it. So I think Korea's done a really good job, and there are things like, for example, the smart electric grid. If you want to be in that business globally, you've got to drive smart electric grid adoption in your own country. But I would just say that that has to apply to many, many other areas, education, fintech. Now I know Korea, I was reading the paper yesterday on the airplane, and President Moon has proposed, your finance regulator, I don't remember the gentleman's name, but he spoke at a finance conference and was talking about how Korea is wanting to drive fintech with what are called regulatory sandboxes. I can't judge how far along the ministry is on that, but that's the right way to go. I mean, that's the right direction. Fintech is going to be very, very disruptive, but it's going to be disruptive in a good way. It's going to make consumers' lives so much better and make banking so much more efficient and easy. Well, clearly the U.S., just because we're like an oil tanker, we're ahead, we're big, we've got a lot of strengths, but unlike the last wave of innovations where the U.S. really was the leader, basically Wintelism Internet, we were the leader. That's not going to be that's not going to be the case anymore. Other countries see that. It's going to be much more of a horse race. Frankly, I don't see any country that's getting it completely right. I look at Europe, for example, and they have under the new Commission president, they're doubling down on the fourth industrial revolution, and so they're good for them. But Europe also has the precautionary principle. They're worried about these technologies. They have the GDPR, and so I don't think Europe is going to be as big a player as they think they're going to be. I really think China is going to be the force to reckon with, just because they are willing to put so much money behind this that I think that's the biggest challenge. I think mid-sized countries like Korea could be very, very well positioned, because I think one of the keys of this next wave is specialization. No country can, even the United States and even China, can be good at everything. And so I think countries that can specialize in a few core things, like, for example, 5G for Korea, or robotics for Japan, or IoT for Korea. I think if Korea specializes and really focuses on a few really core strengths, I think Korea could do very, very well in this space. So I think that's great, and there are a number of different government initiatives in Korea to do that, which I think are fantastic. And so that's why I say I think one of the reasons why I'm somewhat optimistic about Korea's. At the same time, though, I think Korea has two challenges, as I said. One is, can you really embrace entrepreneurial disruption? It's hard. And the second is really software. Korea's, I think, can be better at software historically. Japan, for example, wasn't ever as good at software as the United States was. So really focusing on AI in particular, to me, is going to be a core strength that countries have to master. And so I think the efforts that you and other groups are working in that are all to the good.